Today I'm going to paint a Tuscan landscape with poppies in a very loose impressionistic style using acrylic paints. This is my palette. It's a pretty basic palette with a couple of reds, blues, greens, yellows, burnt sienna ochre, and black and white. I like to keep my palettes pretty simple. I don't want to overdo the colors. I like to mix the colors to get interesting combinations. A good rule of thumb is to have a darker and a lighter version of whatever colors you're using. I tend to stick with primary and greens. Definitely always burnt umber and ochre, black and white, so that you can get the full range of values and keep your colors a bit neutralized. You should always have a reference photo. I'm going to start with a simple drawing, keeping it really light, really simple, no detail. Here's my foreground. There is a little house. So here there's some shrubs, some bushes, some in the front as well. I'm just drawing these in as basic shapes, just basically rounded shapes. All of the definition and defining will come in later with my paint. Remember, it's impressionistic. We're creating the impression of trees and shrubs. Believe it or not, that's it. There are flowers in the front. I'm going to paint those later. I'm going to start with my sky. I'm not trying to get a perfect match here of my reference photo. What I really want to do is just get a bit of a grounding on my sky. I'm just trying to get some good coverage. If you work quickly enough with acrylic, you can mix your colors directly on your paper. I like that it kind of forces you to work quickly, which you want to do anyway with an impressionistic style painting because you don't want to get hung up on details. Keeping your brush nicely moist so that the paint glides on. You don't want sticky paint. Acrylic dries up on you very quickly, so always keep your brush pretty moist. Okay, now I'm going to add a good amount of extra white with this lighter blue that I have. I'm creating the impression of some cloudy shapes up there in the sky. I'm twisting my brush around in this way, that way, all different ways to get some different shapes going on. I might switch my brush now to a rounder brush. There are a good amount of grays as well in my sky. I'm going to add a little bit of gray. Still want to keep things pretty blue, so just a little bit of blue-gray. Sort of coming in here wherever there's a little bit of gray happening. Now I'm really going to work up some of those whites again. Always adjusting as you're going. I think the round brush is working a little bit better than the flat brush was. I'm able to get more of these slightly puffy looking shapes. Now I'm really going to emphasize some of the stronger white areas. These clouds that are more in the foreground are going to appear a little whiter, and I'm just dabbing on, I'm allowing a lot of that gray underneath to continue to shine through, and I'm just dabbing in a little bit extra white on top. This is going to help create the illusion of clouds in the front, clouds in the back, create a bit of that depth in the sky. Now I'm going to work on the house. For the house, I'm going to take some ochre and a good amount of white, creating a bit of this light, almost peachy color. Maybe I'll add the smallest bit of red to make it a bit more peachy. And I'll start with the facade that's facing us in the front. Wherever there's a tree or a bush in the front, I'm just going to ignore that. I'll paint over that drawing and I will paint it in later. It's a lot easier. Now this is the shadowed side. It's actually a little bit lighter at the bottom down here, so I'm going to tap in a little bit more white. I might add the smallest amount of burnt umber now. It's my dark brown. Maybe I do want to darken up this a little bit. It's looking a little too pinkish. It's going to create more of a shadowy pink. Now for the other side, which is catching a lot more of the light, I'll create that light ochre again with a bit of red to make it a bit peach. Lots more white. It's a bit warm too, so maybe I'll add a bit of yellow. See what I get. Now for my rooftop, also, it's a bit reddish but brownish as well. It's definitely kind of a neutral red color, something like that. And using the edge of my brush, I'll do the other part of the rooftop. I'm going to take my small brush, my detail brush. I'm going to continue using this burnt umber here. I'm going to add in some nice dark detail. I also like to mix burnt umber with dark blue. Gives you a really natural dark gray color. It's, I think, better than using black because black is too dark. Now there's the underside of the roof. I want to avoid the tendency to get too detailed here. So sticking with an impressionistic style painting forces me to really just look for the basic shapes and thinking about painting only what's absolutely necessary without painting every single little detail. I don't even know what this darkness is down here. It might be kind of a shadowy area under the veranda, but I'm just going to paint that in just to darken that area. Some very simple window shapes. And there's another one here, a little bit larger. A bit of a chimney maybe. Some shadowy spaces here too. I'm going to paint in the trees and the bushes around the house. I'm going to start with this dark green. I think it's a little bit too greenish. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt umber to it to darken it, maybe even a touch of black, very light on the black. And I'm going to kind of create the base coat really of the color, but when I'm up in my sky here, I want to be careful to use my brush in such a way that I create some of that silhouetted, almost contour shape that the bush is creating. Quite like that color. I'll definitely need a couple more layers though, but just getting in some of the base color. It does cover a little bit the front of this house, and then there are some shrubs at the very base, or maybe some high grass. There's a higher tree, very thin. Just going to pull a line down and then use my brush to create a little bit of shape on either side. Now I might create a slightly lighter green. I'll use that same green but without the brown so much. Maybe I'll add a lighter green to it. There's definitely a bit of yellow in here. It's time, as we're coming forward now on our tree, we need to warm up a little bit. I'm using a slightly smaller brush. And now I'm just going to use this brush in a dabbing motion. I think it needs to be a little bit greener, maybe even a touch of white, so that I can really see that value difference. Tapping around, I'm just looking for some of those lighter areas. making sure that I'm leaving a lot of the dark color underneath still visible. You want that to poke through. That's going to create lots of depth. I'm trying to be careful not to overdo this. I don't want to cover over every dark area that I've painted in, and I don't want it to look overworked. Remember, it's an impression. The important thing is that you're getting some of the values right. So again, I think I might add a little more yellow, maybe a bit more white. Some of the lightness is definitely at the top of the trees. It's catching the light from the sun. So I'm going to continue to add some now lighter values to really bring up some of the light areas in the trees. Remember, use your brush lightly and loosely. You want to maintain some of that dark underneath to create dimension. My brush is pretty dry. I am almost doing a dry brush technique right now because I want to really work on some of those textures. The more different greens you use, the more you can try to mimic some of the different pockets of light. The more interesting your composition will be too. So I have a couple of layers already, very dark, middle layer, and now I'm working on that lighter layer that's really going to indicate the tree area that's jutting forward and catching a lot of the sunlight. I want to bring up some of those shadows again. I may have covered over them a bit too much. Careful not to go too black. Make sure you're mixing some greens and some browns, some dark blues. If you're like me and tend to overwork things, this is a good way to go back in there and unwork some of those areas that you overworked. So I'm just trying to bring in some more of that contrast and work on some of these stems. It's quite dark here at the base of the bushes, so you can kind of darken that up a little bit. Okay, now for our foreground. I'm going to create a base color, just like I did with my trees, and then I'm going to adjust the lights and the darks. So I'm going to start with a bit of a ochre, kind of an ochre plus yellow color in the back, and I'm just going to wash over the back here using the side of my brush. Now I'm going to take some of this green, also with some yellow, just a bit yellow green, and some white, because it's in the distance, and things in the distance are lighter than they are in the foreground. So I want to use a soft green back here. And I'm not covering over all of my yellow. I'm using a slightly dry brush, not too dry, but a little bit dry, because I want to just pull the color over and still see some of that ochre. Now that I'm coming down into the front, I'm going to get a little bit more, a little bit bolder with my greens. Now this is a flower field, so it's not going to be all kind of horizontal. It's actually very splotchy because it's full of flowers and different pockets of foliage. But I'm just creating a base coat right now. So you can see I'm getting a little more intense as I come down. And that's just atmospheric perspective. There is an intensity in the foreground and a softness in the background. Now I'm going to use a smaller brush again, and I'm going to start playing around with some of these oranges, yellows, reds. And really far away, you don't see that these are poppies. It's just an indication of color. And I'm using my brush horizontally. But what I'm basically doing is I'm just looking for striations of color. Now I see that here they're a little bit more intense than over here, but also a little bit redder over here. So We're keeping it very loose. Now before I add in any more flowers in the foreground, I'm going to add in some of the darker greens that I'm seeing in the foreground. The flowers will then be layered over top of that. So there are just splotches of green, and I'm leaving a lot of my light green showing through. And I'm just looking for areas of dark. Remember, the further back you go, your green is going to get softer. So if I'm working in the middle ground, I'll want to soften that green. I'm still maintaining a slightly horizontal brushwork. I quite like the muddiness here. It's creating a bit of a natural sort of tone. My complementary colors are mixing and creating browns. Makes it quite natural looking. Now that I'm in the front again, I'm going to go a little bit more intense. I will take a little brown with my green, maybe even a bit of this dark blue, and create some slightly more intense areas. This will also give your painting a little bit of weight, visual weight at the bottom of your composition, which is always good. Just like with my trees, I want to make sure that some of the lightness underneath is still shining through, and you're creating a lot of different dimensions and shadowy and light areas. And I'm going to bring up the lightness in these greens by going a bit more green, yellow. Take some of these yellows, maybe add some white, and work on some of those lighter pockets. And again, now I'm using my brush, just mimicking some of this foliage here. These are maybe the backside of leaves that are a bit lighter, sort of twisting in the wind. Now I'm starting to create more of a dotted texture here, not unlike I did in the trees. You are not painting every single area that you see, you're just creating some of those impressions of light areas here, there, and everywhere. And as things go further back in the distance, we don't see that texture anymore. Things just become softer. I might soften some of my edges if I find that they're too hard. You can do that while your paint is still wet. Makes things look a bit more blurry. So now I'm going even whiter, and I'm just kind of lightening up a few little bits here and there to create that really strong foreground. Now the poppies are orange and red. They're definitely not straight red, they're a bit orangey red. Certainly the ones further away in the distance are going to appear a little bit more orange, a little bit lighter. I'm just going to darken up some of this redder area so that I can bring these reds forward. You can do kind of like pockets of red. Save the bold red for the foreground. Add some oranges into your red in the background to soften them. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Just kind of experimenting with what's working here. Now you could really stop at any point. I'm not painting exactly all the poppies I see, or even all the clusters of poppies that I see in my composition. I'm just trying to create a nicely balanced composition, making sure I have lots of dark and lights, making sure my intensity is stronger in the front. It's almost like painting pointillism right now, where we're using lots of little dots, and the different colors of our dots are optically mixing. I'm going to start using some bigger brush strokes now, because I want to fill in some of these spots without making it look like they're dots. I don't want things to look too dotted, and I want to keep it quite loose, quite open. Now I might add a detail brush, just define every now and then a couple of flowers. I'm going to mix a little bit of a dark blue and dark brown, create a very dark color. And in some of my flowers in the foreground, I might even go in here and just jot in a little bit of that under part of the flower. It's like, this is where the stem and the petals meet. Creates a little dimension underneath our flowers. And on some of the poppies you can see that it has part of that stem showing. Not really the stem, it's that under part. It just helps to create a little dimension as we come forward. Now I'm going to take some of this white again and some of this very light green. I still have my detail brush here. And I'm going to pop up some of these leaves, I don't know, grass in the foreground. And because they're so white, so light green, it helps to set our flowers off a bit, some contrast. I think it's really what we need now in the foreground, is to build in some of that lighter value to create lots of nice depth, contrast. And this time I'm using my brush in a more vertical motion because I'm trying to indicate a little bit the grass. You can also overlap some of your flowers to help indicate a little bit of depth, that there's some overlapping happening. Always make sure to always change direction if you're drawing anything in nature. Leaves, branches, things are going in all different directions. And then I might just dot a little bit here and there, very, very, very lightly, very tiny, creating the illusion of a little bit of light reflections and little pockets of light. Okay, well, I would say that I'm just about there. Now maybe I'll take some of this just solid red. And I can just brighten up a few of my more foreground flowers. I can also dab in a few little lighter indications of poppies here and there, just to bring up some light. Remember that wherever there's a highlight, there's going to be a shadow. So if I've got some of these little light areas over here, probably want to put a little shadow in there somewhere too. There's always going to be light wherever there is dark. That's a good rule of thumb. I might do one more thing. I might just refine a little bit this horizon line here, make it a bit straighter. Adding a little water, and I can blend it out a little bit. Might repeat that color over here just a little bit. Our stormy sky. Okay, so let's take off the tape. Sometimes the tape will rip your paper, which is not fun. But if you pull at an angle, it usually prevents that from happening. Okay, so this is my somewhat impressionistic style landscape with poppy flowers in the foreground based off of a photograph using acrylic paint. Thank you for watching.